Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you something that might sit heavy for a moment. What if the loneliest place in the world isn't an empty room, but a full life with no one to call a friend? What if the silence you carry isn't because you're weak, but because you've been strong for far too long by yourself? Tonight, I want to talk about a woman with no friend, not because she is unworthy, not because she is broken, but because life, pressure, betrayal, responsibility, and survival have slowly taught her to stand alone. She's the one who shows up even when no one shows up for her, the one who smiles in public and prays in private, the one who learned how to wipe her own tears and still keep moving forward. But hear this clearly, being alone does not mean being abandoned. There is a difference between isolation and preparation. Sometimes God removes the noise so he can refine the voice. Sometimes the season without friends is the season where faith becomes your closest companion and purpose begins to speak louder than popularity. This woman has walked through disappointment, misunderstanding, and quiet nights where only prayer answered back. And yet she's still standing. That's not accidental, that's divine. Because God does some of his deepest work in the hidden places, when applause is gone and all that remains is belief. So if you are that woman, or if you know her, understand this: your story is not a tragedy, it's a testimony in progress. The absence of friends is not the absence of love. Heaven has been walking with you every step, shaping resilience, sharpening vision, and preparing you for connections that won't drain you, but grow you. This is not a speech about loneliness. This is a declaration about strength, faith, and the quiet power of a woman who learned how to stand until the right people, at the right time, meet her where God has already lifted her. Loneliness does not equal unworthiness. That truth needs to be spoken slowly, because too many people have believed the opposite for far too long. Somewhere along the way, silence started to feel like a verdict, like proof that something must be wrong. When friends fade, when calls stop coming, when invitations disappear, the mind starts to ask dangerous questions. What did I do wrong? What am I missing? Why am I not enough? But loneliness is not a measurement of value. It is a circumstance, not a conclusion. There are people surrounded by crowds who feel invisible, and there are people walking alone who are deeply seen by God. Absence does not cancel worth. Being alone does not mean being rejected by heaven. Some of the most powerful transformations happen when there is no audience, when no one is clapping, when no one is validating the journey. That is not punishment. That is pressure shaping purpose. A woman without friends often carries a quiet strength the world doesn't notice. She learns how to listen to her own voice because there is no echo from others. She learns discernment because she can no longer lean on approval. She learns endurance because there is no one else to carry the weight. And somewhere in that solitude, God begins to separate who she is from who she thought she needed to be accepted. Loneliness exposes lies, but it also reveals truth. It reveals that worth was never supposed to come from people who could leave. It was never meant to be sustained by attention, affirmation, or access. Worth was established before anyone ever had the chance to walk away. Before friendships formed or fractured, value was already written into the soul by a creator who does not abandon his work. There is a dangerous habit of measuring life horizontally, counting likes, counting friends, counting seats filled at the table. But heaven measures vertically. Heaven looks at faith, integrity, obedience, and growth. Heaven looks at who you are becoming when no one is watching. And sometimes the crowd has to thin out so the calling can get clear. Loneliness can feel like a wound, but it can also be a shield. It can protect you from voices that would have distracted you relationships that would have drained you, and expectations that would have confined you. Not everyone who leaves is a loss. Not every empty space is meant to be filled immediately. Some gaps are intentional, creating room for strength to develop an identity to settle. A woman with no friends is often a woman who has outgrown certain rooms. Growth can be isolating. Healing can be isolating. Choosing faith over familiarity can be isolating. But none of those things reduce worth. They refine it. Gold is not diminished by fire. It is revealed by it. God is not confused by your solitude. He is not absent from it. He sits with you in the quiet, shaping confidence that doesn't crumble when approval disappears. Teaching you how to stand without leaning, showing you that being chosen by Him outweighs being chosen by people. Loneliness does not mean you were overlooked. It may mean you were set apart. It does not mean you were forgotten. It may mean you are being prepared. It does not mean you lack value. It means your value is not dependent on who stayed, who left, or who never showed up at all. Strength built in silence is often the kind that lasts the longest. Noise can motivate for a moment, but silence forges something deeper. When no one is cheering, correcting, or confirming, you are forced to confront who you really are. There is no performance, no audience to impress, no mask to maintain. Silence strips life down to truth, and truth is where real strength begins. In loud seasons, strength can be borrowed. You borrow energy from encouragement, confidence from validation, courage from community. But in silent seasons, there is no borrowing. Everything you carry alone. Every decision is made without applause. Every step forward is taken without reassurance. And in that space, resilience is no longer theoretical. It becomes lived experience. Silence teaches discipline. When there is no one reminding you to keep going, you learn how to govern yourself. You learn how to pray without being prompted, how to show up without being asked, how to push forward without being praised. This is where strength stops being emotional and starts becoming intentional. Faith matures here because it no longer depends on atmosphere. It depends on conviction. A woman growing in silence develops an internal compass. She stops looking outward for direction and begins to trust what God has planted within her. She learns how to sit with her thoughts instead of running from them. She learns how to hear God without the interference of other voices. Silence refines perception, sharpening discernment until truth becomes familiar and distraction becomes obvious. There is a difference between being quiet and being empty. Silence is not a lack, it is a space. And what fills that space determines who you become. Some people fill silence with fear, replaying wounds and rehearsing rejection. But strength is built when silence is filled with reflection, prayer, and purpose. When you choose to grow instead of grieve indefinitely, silence also reveals endurance. Without witnesses, quitting becomes easier. No one would blame you. No one might even notice. Yet strength is choosing to continue anyway, to keep building, believing, and becoming, even when the journey feels invisible. That kind of perseverance cannot be taught in crowds. It is learned in isolation. God often uses silence to remove dependency. Not because people are bad, but because reliance on people can weaken reliance on Him. When voices fade, His becomes clearer. When distractions fall away, direction sharpens. Silence is where identity stabilizes, no longer shifting with opinions or outcomes. The strength born in silence is calm, not frantic. It does not need to announce itself. It is steady, rooted, and unshakable. It knows how to wait without panicking and how to act without rushing. It carries wisdom because it has had time to observe rather than react. A woman shaped by silence does not crumble when life gets quiet again because she has been here before. She knows how to sit in stillness without losing herself. She knows how to draw from faith instead of frenzy. What once felt like emptiness becomes a familiar training ground. Silence may have felt like neglect, but it was actually instruction. Every quiet moment was strengthening resolve, deepening faith, and anchoring confidence where it could not be stolen by noise or shaken by absence. Isolation as divine preparation is one of the hardest truths to accept because it contradicts how we measure progress. We are taught that momentum looks like connection, that growth looks like visibility, and that success looks like being surrounded. So when isolation arrives, it feels like regression, like something has gone wrong. But often, isolation is not a setback. It is a strategy. There are seasons when God intentionally narrows the circle so the assignment can be clarified. When too many voices are present, purpose gets diluted. Advice multiplies, opinions clash, and conviction weakens. Isolation removes the excess so focus can be restored. It is in the quiet separation that direction becomes unmistakable. Preparation requires space. Seeds are not developed in open air. They are buried. Roots do not grow where they can be seen. They grow in darkness. Isolation creates the conditions for depth. Without distraction, character is strengthened. Without comparison, identity stabilizes. Without constant interaction, spiritual sensitivity sharpens. Many women misinterpret isolation as rejection, but preparation often feels lonely before it feels powerful. The training ground is rarely crowded. The weight of future responsibility demands inner strength that cannot be developed in comfort. Isolation forces confrontation with fear, insecurity, and doubt not to destroy you, but to strip them of control. When God prepares someone, He often removes the familiar. Comfort zones are dismantled so reliance can shift. What once felt supportive may quietly become limiting. Isolation reveals who you are without reinforcement. It exposes dependency patterns and replaces them with discipline and faith. Isolation also protects. Not every environment is safe for growth. Not every relationship can handle your next level. Distance can be mercy, shielding you from premature exposure and unnecessary damage. Preparation requires timing, and isolation often preserves that timing. There is a refinement that only happens when no one else is watching. Motives are tested in isolation. Are you still faithful without recognition? Are you still obedient without affirmation? Are you still committed when the reward feels distant? These questions shape integrity, and integrity sustains calling. In isolation, God often speaks about the future without explaining the process. He plants vision before providing evidence. This stretches trust. You learn to walk by faith instead of confirmation. You learn to move without needing consensus. Preparation is about alignment, not approval. Isolation dismantles the need to be understood. It teaches you to be anchored in what God said, not in how others interpret your journey. Misunderstanding becomes easier to bear when conviction is clear. Strength grows when explanation is no longer required. What feels like being set aside is often being set up. Isolation is not abandonment. It is intentional distance with purpose. It is God saying, this next chapter requires clarity, capacity, and courage that cannot be built in crowds. Many emerge from isolation different, not because they were broken, but because they were shaped. Their voice carries authority because it was formed in quiet. Their confidence is steady because it was tested alone. Their faith is deep because it had no one else to lean on. Isolation ends when preparation is complete, when the foundation is strong enough to carry what is coming, when the vision is clear enough to withstand opposition, when the heart is steady enough to remain faithful under pressure. Until then, isolation remains a sacred space where destiny is quietly assembled. Faith as the closest companion becomes real when every other presence fades, when conversations stop, when support feels distant, when familiar voices no longer fill the room, faith steps out of theory and into necessity. It is easy to talk about believing when life is crowded. It is harder and far more powerful to believe when faith is the only thing sitting beside you in the quiet. In solitude, faith becomes personal. There is no borrowed belief, no shared momentum, no collective energy to lean on. Every prayer is your own. Every moment of trust is intentional. Faith is no longer inherited or inspired by others. It is chosen daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes breath by breath. This is where faith moves from being something you say to something you live. Faith as a companion listens when no one else does. It stays present in moments of doubt without demanding perfection. It does not rush the process or shame the questions. It allows space for fear while still calling you forward. This kind of faith is not loud. It is steady. It sits with you in uncertainty and reminds you that God's presence is not dependent on your feelings. When faith becomes closest, prayer becomes conversation rather than performance. There is no script, no need to sound strong or spiritual. There is honesty, vulnerability, and raw dependence. You learn that God is not intimidated by silence or offended by tears. Faith teaches you that showing up as you are is enough. Faith also becomes a guide. Without external affirmation, faith begins to direct decisions. You learn how to pause before reacting, how to wait without panicking, how to move without rushing. Faith sharpens discernment, helping you recognize peace, even when clarity is incomplete. It teaches you to trust God's timing instead of forcing outcomes. In seasons without companionship, faith fills emotional gaps in unexpected ways. It brings comfort that does not fade with circumstances. It brings reassurance that does not require explanation. It provides stability when everything else feels uncertain. Faith does not replace human connection, but it sustains the heart until healthy connection arrives. There is intimacy that develops when faith is all you have. You begin to recognize God's voice in subtle ways, through a moment of calm in chaos, through a quiet sense of direction, through strength that appears when exhaustion says, there should be none left. Faith becomes familiar, like a presence that understands without needing words. Faith, as the closest companion, also confronts. It challenges patterns of fear, self-reliance, and control. It asks hard questions about trust and surrender. It calls you to release what you cannot manage and rest in what God already holds. This kind of faith does not always comfort first. Sometimes it corrects so growth can continue. When faith stands closest, it reshapes identity. You stop defining yourself by who is present or absent. You stop measuring worth by attention or approval. You begin to see yourself through the lens of divine purpose, rather than human response. Faith anchors you to truth when emotions fluctuate. Faith also teaches patience. It helps you endure unanswered prayers without losing hope. It strengthens you to wait without becoming bitter. It reminds you that delay is not denial, and that silence is not absence. Faith stays when answers don't come quickly, holding space for trust to deepen. As faith becomes closest, fear loses authority. Anxiety no longer dictates decisions. Loneliness no longer defines identity. Faith becomes the steady presence that whispers strength when weakness is loud, direction when confusion rises, and peace when circumstances refuse to cooperate. It becomes the companion that walks with you through uncertainty, shaping resilience, deepening trust, and anchoring the soul in something unshakable. Hidden seasons shape purpose in ways visible moments never could. When life pulls you out of the spotlight, when progress feels slow and recognition disappears, it can feel like stagnation. But what looks like stillness on the outside is often intense movement within. Purpose is rarely formed in public view. It is cultivated where pressure is quiet and expectations are minimal. In hidden seasons, motives are purified. Without attention or applause, the question becomes simple and honest. Why do you keep going when no one is watching? Purpose that survives obscurity is purpose that is real. When validation is removed, intention is exposed. What remains is what matters. Hidden seasons teach alignment. Without the distraction of performance, you begin to align your actions with your values. You stop chasing what looks impressive and start pursuing what feels true. Purpose becomes less about image and more about obedience. This alignment builds integrity, and integrity gives purpose longevity. Growth in hidden seasons is internal before it is external. Character develops quietly. Discipline forms without pressure. Confidence grows without comparison. These are not skills learned on stages or platforms. They are shaped in consistency, in showing up for yourself, in honoring commitments no one else knows about. Hidden seasons also sharpen vision. When noise fades, clarity increases. You start to see what truly matters and what has been draining your energy. You learn to say no without guilt and yes without fear. Purpose becomes focused rather than scattered, intentional rather than reactive. In these seasons, patience is strengthened. Purpose is not rushed because rushing exposes cracks. Hidden time allows roots to deepen so future growth can be sustained. You learn how to wait without resentment and how to trust without constant reassurance. This patience becomes a foundation that supports future responsibility. There is protection in being hidden. Exposure before readiness can damage confidence and distort calling. Hidden seasons guard you from premature pressure and unnecessary comparison. They allow space for mistakes without consequences and learning without judgment. Purpose matures safely when it is not constantly evaluated. Hidden seasons redefine success. Instead of measuring progress by visibility, you begin to measure it by growth. Healing becomes success. Consistency becomes success. Choosing faith over fear becomes success. Purpose expands when success is no longer dependent on recognition. Isolation within hidden seasons fosters self-awareness. You confront habits, fears, and patterns that crowds often conceal. You learn what needs to change before purpose can be fulfilled. This awareness is uncomfortable, but it is essential. Purpose that avoids self-examination eventually collapses under pressure. Hidden seasons also strengthen trust in God. When outcomes are delayed and affirmation is absent, reliance shifts. Faith becomes the anchor instead of achievement. You learn to trust the process without needing to see the full picture. Purpose becomes rooted in calling rather than outcome. Many people misunderstand hidden seasons as wasted time, but nothing that produces depth is wasted. Every quiet moment is building capacity. Every unseen effort is increasing endurance. Purpose is being prepared to handle success without losing humility and influence, without losing identity. When the hidden season ends, purpose emerges with substance. It carries weight because it was shaped without shortcuts. It stands firm because it was tested in quiet. The unseen work becomes evident, not through noise, but through impact. Hidden seasons do not delay purpose, they define it. Resilience formed through disappointment is often misunderstood because disappointment is rarely welcomed as a teacher. It arrives uninvited, carrying loss, unmet expectations, and unanswered prayers. Yet resilience is not born from ease. It is shaped where hope has been stretched and trust has been tested. Disappointment does not destroy strength on its own. How it is processed determines what it produces. When expectations collapse, the first instinct is often retreat. The heart wants to protect itself, to lower standards, to stop believing as deeply. But resilience begins when disappointment is faced instead of avoided. It begins when pain is acknowledged without letting it define identity. This confrontation requires courage. because it means choosing growth over bitterness. Disappointment strips illusions. It reveals where faith was placed in people, outcomes, or timing rather than in God. This exposure is uncomfortable, but it is clarifying. Resilience forms when faith is reanchored, when trust is rebuilt on something that cannot fail or walk away. Strength deepens when reliance shifts from external assurances to internal conviction. Each disappointment carries a lesson about endurance. You learn that you can survive what once felt unbearable. The heart stretches, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Resilience grows quietly as you continue to show up, continue to believe, continue to try, even after being let down. Disappointment also teaches emotional regulation. Instead of reacting impulsively, resilience learns to respond thoughtfully. You learn how to pause before closing off completely. You learn how to feel deeply without drowning. This balance does not come naturally. It is developed through repeated moments of choosing stability over chaos. There is a refinement that occurs when disappointment becomes familiar. Expectations become wiser, not smaller. Hope becomes anchored, not naive. Trust becomes selective, not absent. Resilience does not harden the heart, it strengthens it. It teaches discernment without destroying compassion. Disappointment exposes patterns. It reveals where boundaries were missing and where self-worth was compromised. Resilience is formed when these patterns are corrected, when lessons are learned rather than repeated. Growth happens when disappointment is treated as information, not condemnation. Resilience through disappointment also deepens empathy. Having felt loss, rejection, or delay, you become more aware of others carrying similar weight. Strength becomes quieter and more understanding. There is less judgment and more grace. Resilience allows space for others without losing yourself. God uses disappointment to build spiritual stamina. When prayers go unanswered and outcomes fall apart, faith is stretched. Resilience develops when belief continues without evidence. Trust matures when obedience remains, despite uncertainty. This kind of resilience cannot be taught, it must be lived. There is also freedom found in disappointment. When something you depended on fails, it forces reevaluation, priorities shift, identity is reclaimed. Resilience grows as you discover you are not defined by what did not work out. Strength forms when you realize you can adapt without losing purpose. Over time, disappointment loses its power to destabilize. It still hurts, but it no longer controls direction. Resilience allows forward movement without denial. You carry the lesson without carrying the weight. What once threatened to break you becomes part of your foundation. Resilience formed through disappointment is steady, not dramatic. It does not announce survival. It demonstrates it through consistency. It is visible in the ability to hope again, to trust again, to move forward without forgetting, but without being held captive. Disappointment may have shaped the path, but resilience determines how the journey continues. God's presence in unseen moments is often the most misunderstood aspect of faith because we are conditioned to look for evidence in visibility. We expect proof in results, reassurance in recognition, and confirmation in outcomes. So when nothing seems to be happening, when prayers feel unanswered and progress looks invisible, the assumption is that God must be distant. But unseen does not mean absent. It means working beyond what the eye can track. Unseen moments are where trust is refined. When there is no immediate reward, faith must operate without reinforcement. You believe not because you see, but because you know. This kind of belief is not emotional, it is anchored. It holds steady when circumstances offer no encouragement. God's presence in these moments is not loud or dramatic. It is consistent, sustaining, and intentional. In unseen moments, God often works internally before he works externally. While you wait for change around you, He is reshaping perception within you. He is adjusting how you respond, how you listen, how you endure. Growth that happens inside rarely announces itself, but it becomes evident later in how you handle pressure, disappointment, and delay. There are prayers that seem to echo in silence, not because they were ignored, but because the answer requires preparation. God's presence remains, even when explanation does not. He stays close while withholding clarity, teaching dependence rather than control. The unseen season becomes an invitation to trust His character instead of His timing. Unseen moments also reveal where faith truly rests. When there is no outcome to celebrate, belief is tested. Do you still trust when nothing changes? Do you still obey when obedience feels costly? God's presence is often strongest where faith is most stretched. He does not abandon the process simply because it is uncomfortable. In the unseen, God guards you from premature exposure. Visibility before readiness can damage confidence and distort purpose. What feels like delay may actually be protection. God's presence shields growth until it is sustainable. He works quietly, ensuring that what emerges will endure. Unseen moments can feel lonely, but they are rarely empty. God occupies the space where reassurance is missing. He listens when there are no witnesses. He strengthens when no one is applauding. His presence does not depend on atmosphere. It remains constant regardless of emotion or outcome. In these moments, God teaches you how to listen. Without noise, distractions fade. You begin to recognize His guidance in subtle ways. Through peace that settles unexpectedly. Through conviction that nudges direction. Through restraint that prevents missteps. His presence becomes familiar, not because life is easy, but because dependence increases. Unseen moments build spiritual confidence. When you survive seasons that look fruitless, you gain assurance that God is reliable beyond appearances. You learn that faith does not require constant confirmation. You trust because you have experienced His presence in absence, His nearness in silence. God's presence in unseen moments also reshapes patience. Waiting no longer feels wasted. Stillness becomes productive. You begin to understand that movement is not the only form of progress. Preparation often looks like inactivity from the outside while being deeply active within over time. Unseen moments accumulate strength. They become reference points, reminders that God was present when no one else could see it. These moments anchor faith, providing stability when future uncertainty arises. When visibility returns, you are not dependent on it because you were sustained without it. God's presence does not diminish in hidden seasons. It intensifies, it settles deeper. It becomes the constant that outlasts emotion, circumstance, and outcome. What was unseen was never unsupported. What felt quiet was never empty. God was present, shaping, sustaining, and guiding, even when there was no visible proof. Right connections arrive at the right time, not by accident, but by alignment. Many people rush relationships because loneliness creates urgency, but urgency often leads to compromise. Timing matters because connection without readiness can become distraction instead of destiny. When the right people arrive too early, they can confuse direction. When they arrive too late, they can miss the moment. God's timing protects both you and the connection. There are seasons when relationships are intentionally absent, not because connection is unimportant, but because preparation is incomplete. Before the right people can walk with you, you must be able to stand on your own. Independence is not isolation. It is stability. The ability to be whole alone prevents dependence later. Right connections require wholeness, not neediness. Timing ensures that connections are mutual rather than one-sided. When people meet too early, one often pours while the other drains. Growth balances capacity. At the right time, connection becomes exchange instead of extraction. Support flows both ways. Respect replaces tolerance. Presence becomes intentional rather than obligatory. Right connections recognize you without requiring explanation. When timing aligns, you no longer have to convince, perform, or overextend to be understood. Shared values create ease. Mutual vision creates momentum. These connections do not demand shrinking or striving. They meet you where growth has already taken place. Delay in connection often develops discernment. After disappointment, wisdom sharpens. You begin to recognize patterns, red flags, and intentions more clearly. Right timing ensures you are no longer drawn to familiarity that harms, but to alignment that strengthens. Discernment protects purpose from unnecessary damage. When the right people arrive, they do not replace God, they complement what He has already built. They affirm, not define. They support, not steer. Timing ensures that faith remains the foundation and relationships become reinforcement. Connections formed on this foundation endure pressure. Right connections arrive when you no longer fear being alone. Desperation repels alignment, but peace attracts it. When solitude no longer feels like punishment, connection becomes choice. You choose relationships from clarity rather than emptiness. This choice transforms the quality of who enters your life. There is also preparation happening on the other side. While you are being shaped, so are they. Timing aligns stories, experiences, and maturity levels. Right connections require parallel growth. What feels like waiting is often synchronization. When the right people arrive, they do not interrupt purpose, they enhance it. They challenge you without competing. They encourage without controlling. They walk with you without trying to lead your path. Timing ensures that connection strengthens direction rather than diverting it. These connections bring confirmation without flattery. They speak truth without cruelty. They celebrate growth without envy. Right timing filters out relationships that would have required constant maintenance and replaces them with ones that bring peace. The arrival of right connections often feels natural rather than dramatic. There is no rush, no pressure, no confusion. Trust develops steadily. Respect is immediate. Boundaries are honored. These are signs of alignment, not coincidence. Right connections do not arrive to fill a void. They arrive to walk beside purpose. They are not rewards for waiting. They are reinforcements for readiness. Timing transforms relationships from survival tools into destiny partners. What once felt like delay becomes clarity. What once felt like absence becomes protection. Right connections arrive when identity is secure, faith is rooted, and purpose is clear. Not early, not late, exactly when they can be sustained without loss, distraction, or compromise.